All right. Do science and scripture agree? That's a good chapter. I like this chapter. What do you guys think? Anything that stick out right away? Um, what'd you like about the chapter? What'd you not like about it?
I was just curious how the 4004 BC number came about. Is that
Yeah, Bishop Ussher back in the 1500s. Of course, you can like David's reign and things like that. You can pretty much figure out, through comparative comparing with other nations around. You can kind of figure out. I think David was like 1000 BC, and you can work backwards. I mean, there's debate about the Exodus, probably like 1400 BC. Abraham probably about 2000 BC. It's pretty common. But then to go beyond that, you kind of got to go by the genealogies. And so you look back and you say, okay, so and so was the father of so and so, father of so and so, and then you work backwards. In the early chapters of Genesis, they give the ages of the people. Remember that? Methuselah was 969 years old, right? He was 675 years old and he gave birth to so and so, right? And so you just work backwards. And so you take those numbers, you start with a date that you know, and you figure out, and he worked out to 4004 BC. I think he even said it was like a Thursday, October 13th or something like that. 10 o'clock in the morning or something like that. God created the heavens and the world. I don't, it was something like, it was like really crazy. But he'd worked it out going back through the genealogies. And for several hundred years, that was kind of accepted as fact. They were kind of impressed. Well, this makes sense. But the biggest problem with those genealogies is they're probably skipping generations. Um, and maybe the numbers are symbolic or something like that. So it's probably not as compact as those numbers make it seem. It's probably more and more centuries there than those numbers imply. But still, even if you were to say that those were centuries, you'd still end up like 10,000 BC, maybe, right? You could probably say, okay, yeah, maybe 10,000 BC. So if you push the biblical chronology back, you end up with a young Earth. It's pretty hard not to um, come to that conclusion. Though nobody goes with Usher's chronology today. In fact, I remember when I was a kid, I had a Bible. I think it was a King James Bible, and it had the dates up on the top. So as you turn to the page, it said 1450 BC or something like that. 37 AD. It's kind of cool. Yeah, you had the actual dates on the top of the page of the Bible. And so a lot of people thought that that was a part of the Bible itself, not something that was added, millennia after the texts were written. So it was misleading. And so I think there's still some people. I don't know if anyone even today is aware of that. I don't think anyone's had those numbers in Bibles for over 70 years now. Since I was a kid, I don't remember. They never printed Bibles for 60 years. I mean, the Bibles I had they were old. So it's been a century before those. I think those numbers have been used. They have been published. So I don't know. Have you heard anybody who talks about? Oh yeah, the Bible's said creation's 4004 BC. Yeah, know anybody who says that? Yeah. So it's probably not going to be an issue. You might run into it if someone's done some reading, about arguments against Christianity. They might bump into that, which I think is his first point, is well-meaning Christians, right? Well-meaning but misguided Christians often make the Bible say what it doesn't say. And that is some problems, right? So sometimes people make the Bible, so you have a poetic passage and then you make that literal. That can create some problems and things like that. So, and especially with this 4004 BC, that's, created some problems. So don't confuse a misguided interpretation of the Bible as conflicting with scripture as the Bible conflicting with scripture. Does that make sense? That was his point. That's his first point. There are conflicts between scripture and science. But as you saw through this chapter, there's probably less conflict than most people make it out to be. The flip side is that scientists, we'll see when we look at Carl Sagan, many scientists also make statements that go beyond the facts. Right. I remember when I was a kid, dinosaurs were huge. Man, if Jurassic Park had come out when I was a kid, I would have been blown away. It's like, oh my, because we love dinosaurs, right? But even as you go back and look at the dinosaur books, the facts about dinosaurs have changed over the last 50, 60 years. Now they have feathers or whatever. They're like chickens. I mean, it's like, wow, it's like totally different. So the facts about dinosaurs aren't really facts. Those are, I mean, some guy finds a bone, a leg bone, and he creates a whole dinosaur out of it. Really? I mean, it's like, yeah, there's this dinosaur called Iguanosaurus, and they don't have a full skeleton of it. They just have one bone, and some guy reconstructs it and says, oh, yeah, there was this dinosaur, and it had feathers, and it had a beak, and how would you know it has feathers? There are no fossils of feathers, right? Right. I mean, it's like, so they're making it up. They're making their best guesses. They were cold-blooded, now they're warm-blooded, they're back to cold-blooded, right? And so scientists make hypotheses and they extrapolate and they try to put things together. They try to take all this data and say, well, all of this is true. Then the dinosaurs must have been this way, or the atmosphere must have been this way, or this must have been that way. But do they know? Is that true? That's a guess, right? It's a guess. But they present it as it's fact, right? You know what I'm talking about? Right. And they present it as fact. So it goes both ways. I mean, so you have to be careful, and you have to be, evaluate what people are saying and say, okay, wait a minute, let's take a couple of steps back. So if you can eliminate some of that, noise, I think when you look at the core of what's going on, there's a lot of agreement between the Bible and science. Then he goes on to the next point is, page 143, when a lot of times when a scientist speaks, he's an expert, right? And Ashley, you ever have a cardiologist comes in, right? And he's been doing heart surgery for 20 years and he starts talking. What do? You take notes, don't you? I mean, this is God's word. This is coming directly from God. This is scripture because he knows. But if that same cardiologist gets up and he starts talking about love, does he have the same gravitas, the same depth? No, he's outside of his realm. Or if he starts talking about, the stars, he starts talking about, astronomy. It's like, wait a minute, you're outside of your field. You're not an expert. But the problem is because he's a cardiologist and has that weight, and he has that when he speaks, everyone listens. Then when he talks about other things outside of his expertise, a lot of that, respect and all that dignity and honor go with him. And they say, oh, so-and-so said this, it must be true. Because he's been so right about everything else. Now when he speaks about things he knows nothing about, he must be true too. So be careful about that when they speak outside of their expertise. So famously, he talks about Carl Sagan. You guys know who Carl Sagan is? He's been dead for a while now, but he was famous for his TV show, The Cosmos. And he would always come on, the cosmos is all that there ever was or ever will be. Is that a scientific statement, Phil?
Yes.
Is it? Can you run a scientific experiment on that?
Oh, no, you can't.
Yeah, you
You
can't.
can't really experiment that.
It's a
That's
philosophical
very bold
statement.
claim.
It's a philosophical statement. He also said, Whatever significance we humans have is that which we make ourselves. Is that a scientific statement, Inky? Is that a scientific, backed by repeatable scientific experiments, verified by multiple research teams? So we know for certain that whatever significance we humans have is which we make for ourselves. No, that's a philosophical
Probably
argument.
not. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
probably
it's
not.
It's not. If we must worship a power greater than ourselves, does it not make sense to worship the sun and the stars? Well, that's definitely scientific, right, Ashley? Sounds like theology, doesn't it? So here you have a cosmologist, or I think he was an astronomer. Here you have an astronomer making a theological statement. I mean, does he have the same authority speaking about philosophy and theology as he does when he speaks about astronomy? Now, when Carl Sagan starts talking about, hey, the sun is like this, or these stars are like that, he starts talking about the solar system and galaxies and things like that. Yeah, the guy's probably right, or at least he's got the data and he has some weight. He knows more about that than I do. But when he starts making a theological statement that we should worship the sun and the moon instead of God, I mean, dude, you're outside of your field. You don't have the same relevance, right? We don't have to listen to that in the same way we'd have to listen to his statements about stars and planets and things like that. So be very careful. A lot of what passes for science is really philosophy or scientism, right? And you take the facts, you take the data, and then you make philosophical statements based on that. It could be true. I'm not saying it's not true, but now you've passed out of science and you're into philosophy and theology or psychology or whatever, and you're in a different realm and you don't have that same gravitas. So be careful that you're not being hoodwinked, I guess, by that. He goes on to talk about in page 143 that faith is suspect. Do you agree, Phil, that if you cannot verify something through the scientific method, it's not valid or true or real?
Definitely not.
And why not?
I mean, an example he uses in the book, but I think in general, like it could just be experimenting emotions. So like love or anger, like how do you do a hypothesis on that, or something that's happened historically? You can't, redo what's happened in the past. So because of that, you can't just say those aren't valid because we all feel it, we all know it's true.
What about the laws of logic? Can you validate those scientifically, actually?
I don't think so.
You can't, right? You can't. The laws of logic are outside of science. Thank you. You like numbers. Is math scientific?
In a way, yeah.
Is it? Can you run a scientific experiment on math?
Well, I think numbers is mostly facts, right? 1 + 1 is 2. You can prove that 1 + 1 is 2, but if you go to a lab or something, we probably can't validate it. But in school they teach you, they have these like, I remember in kindergarten we had these we had a block, red block, and a blue block.
Okay.
If you add the one red block and one blue block, you get 2.
Okay.
Or if you
I suppose you could do that scientifically. Every time that I do that, I put one block in, I put another block in, I always end up with 2 blocks. So I guess you could run a scientific experiment that way. But you're still getting to higher math. Yeah, now you're in
like calculus or something, probably not be.
calculus. I should give you that. I saw this incredible video about Yeah, imaginary numbers. And he
Hmm.
showed like an equation with, with imaginary numbers in it. And just the incredible um graphs that come out of that is mind-blowing, right? So there's this beauty to these numbers, but it's not scientific, right? How do you measure an imaginary number?
Can't. It's imaginary.
It's imaginary. Yet it's math, and yet it is real. I mean, it is, we think, oh, imaginary numbers don't exist. I mean, those are, I don't even know what word to use. They're real entities. I mean, they are logically real, right? So you start getting into the realm of math and logic and philosophy, and you're outside of the realm of science. And I would even say sociology, psychology, um, anthropology, yeah, even anthropology. I mean, those are really, they're trying to be scientific, right? They're trying to follow scientific methods, but really they're outside the scientific method. And you don't have the same validity for a psychological experiment as you do for uh, let's say, a physical experiment. And so you can't say, hey, if I can't verify it with a scientific method, it doesn't exist. No, that's not true. I think 90% of the stuff we deal with in life is outside the realm of science. So there are other methods of coming to truth or understanding the world besides the scientific method. And because science deals only with the physical, right, the material world, God himself is outside the purview of science. Because God, by definition, is outside of time and space. So, Phil, could you think of an experiment you could run that could prove that God does not exist?
Does not exist, no.
Ashley, if you were to prove that God does not exist, what would you have to do? Scientifically. You're the scientist here. You're the closest we have to a scientist. As a medical doctor, Dr. Chun. I mean, you would have to be every place in the universe at the same time. Wouldn't you? And say, look, I don't see God here. I don't see God behind this planet. I don't see God over here. I don't see God inside this atom. I don't see God in this galaxy. But you have to do it all at the same time because maybe God's running and he's hiding behind you as you're over here. He's running over there, right? You can't find God, right? Unless you were everywhere in the universe at the same time for all time, right? Because maybe God exists in the past, but he does not. Maybe God will exist in the future. So you'd have to be past, present, and future all at the same time to prove that God doesn't exist. Well, you'd have to be God to prove that God doesn't exist. Does that make sense? With a scientific methodology. But even then, even if you could do that, and you're still inside time and space, you're still inside the physical universe, God's on the outside of it. You'll never know, right? So you cannot run a scientific experiment to prove that God exists or God doesn't exist. It's beyond the ability of the scientific method because God, by definition, is outside time and space, outside of the material world. He's supernatural. So the scientific method is very, very limited in what it can study. Therefore, a lot of what the Bible talks about is outside the realm of science. Right? The Bible talks about having a relationship with God, talks about the Holy Spirit, talks about redemption and salvation and sin, and right, talks about all those things. You can't run a scientific experiment on all those things. So there alone, 90% of the Bible cannot be in conflict with science. It can't be. There's no way it can be in conflict with science because they're dealing with two different realms. So once you begin to realize that, so when the Bible does talk about things that are relevant to science, that's what we have to look at. And this book mainly focuses on creation, right? The act of creation. Where did the world come from? he goes on in the fact that scientists use faith as well. Inky, what are some of the things that scientists have to believe and they can't prove?
The universe is orderly,
Mm-hmm. There's four things.
objective truth exists and is not knowable.
Knowable.
The reliability of the sense perceptions, the repeatability of a laboratory experiment. So
So
these are
four
four,
things, yeah.
four
So
things.
Phil, what if one of those was not true? You take any one of those four, what would happen to the scientific method?
Then it would fail, and as a result, the method wouldn't be validated or verifiable.
Right. So here's four things that a scientist has to believe on faith, and we'll talk more about that later. And if any one of those four is not true, then all that they're doing with science is meaningless. That's pretty impressive. So that's one thing you cannot, if someone starts saying, "Oh, you have faith and I have facts," so take a step back. Let's talk about the scientific method and bring up those 4 points, right? You have to have just as much faith in the scientific method as I have to have, let's say, in the Bible. In fact, this is kind of interesting. Ashley, who invented the modern scientific method? Not necessarily a name of a person, but do you know who did that? Who invented science?
Probably an early scientist. I don't know.
Probably an early scientist. Was it the Egyptians?
Oh.
Was it the Greeks? Was it the Romans? Was it the Muslims? No, it was the Christians.
Mhm.
Yeah, so the scientific method starts, the 1400s, 1500s. And basically they rejected the Greek view of the world, the polytheistic, chaotic view of the world. Right? If you have a polytheistic, chaotic view of the world, that's number one, the universe is orderly. If the universe isn't orderly, can you really run experiments? Right? Oh, Zeus messed up my science experiment, right? Oh, I can't trust it, right? You can't trust anything you do because the gods could have come in and, messed with your experiment. And so the Christian says, no, God created the world. The world is orderly, right? The world has truth in it, and we can study the world, and we can think the thoughts of God. So if we can understand how the world works, we can think God's thoughts after him. That was the driving impetus of the beginning of the scientific movement. It was Christians trying to understand the world so they could understand God better. And so they came up with the scientific method to investigate the world. So science, by its very beginning, is based on Christian belief. Because it's Christians who believe the world is orderly. It's Christians who believe objective truth is out there and it's knowable. Right? It's Christians that say God created our eyes, we can trust him, right? And so Christians believed, hey, the world operates with orderly laws, so we can experiment with that. So those 4 points of the scientific method are based on theological, biblical concepts. And what's going to happen as we throw God out of our life, out of our world, we're going to lose the scientific method, right? And just in the past 3-4 years, it's beginning to show that people don't really believe in science anymore. The people say, oh, you got to believe the science. The science is settled. Wait a minute. Science is settled? That's not a scientific statement. Science, by its definition, means you have to keep experimenting. You can't just say, sit down, shut up, and put the mask on, because I said the science says it works, and you can't question that. Well, if I can't question it, then it's not science. It's no longer science. It becomes dogma. And so what now is passing for science is quickly becoming dogma. And so the scientific method, at least in certain places, is not being allowed. Because why? You lose those 4 fundamental presuppositions, then you lose science itself. So both sides have presuppositions. Look at page 146. Christians believe, and this is interesting, Christians believe science is one avenue for discovering truth. Okay. It's not the only avenue, but it is one avenue. So if you're a Christian, you say, yeah, I believe in science, but I also believe there's other ways of knowing. I'm not throwing science out. I'm just saying there's science, there's theology, there's philosophy, there's other ways of knowing. And number two, there's nothing incompatible between reason or intelligence and faith in God. So as a Christian, we believe you can study the world scientifically and still believe in God. They're not incompatible, right? And Christians' theory believe that God exists. He existed before the world came into existence. He's the one who made the world. And so William Paley, of course, the watchmaker, you find a watch on the sand, on the beach, you say, oh, wow, that's been there for 10 million years. No, this looks pretty new. It looks like someone made it. You find an iPhone laying on the street, you say, oh, wow, look at that cool rock, right? No, you say, someone designed this. It's pretty obvious, right? So we believe that God has created the world because we believe when we see things that we make, we know that someone made them. So when we see the world, we say, hey, obviously, and we'll talk about information and things like that. Obviously, someone made that. And then number five, Christians, we believe it's possible to differentiate between truth and error, right? So those are presuppositions that we have. And those, I think, are logical presuppositions. An agnostic or atheist believes Darwin's basic evolutionary mechanism is foundational to understanding reality. So their fundamental approach to reality is very materialistic. Right? They're going to approach, you can only know the world through evolution or through the scientific method. Random variations and natural selection explain all the changes in living beings. They're going to say everything, including our minds, can be reduced to material base. We are survival mechanisms, survival machines. Right? So even your thoughts basically are just random firings of electrical impulses in the neurons. It's random. You're just a random bundle of atoms that bump together. And even your own thoughts, I mean, you can't even trust them as your own. You're probably thinking is not even under your control. And so that's basically what you have to believe if you don't believe in God. And that becomes almost self-destructive if you really believe that. And so what happens is they import. They want the benefits of a Christian worldview without the Christian worldview. Right? They want to have the certainty of truth without having truth. Right? And so we can talk about that when we talk about cultural apologetics. But they reject the foundation, but they want the benefits. And so Nietzsche, God's dead, and people are still believing in truth because you guys are nuts. If God is dead, there is no truth. There is no right or wrong. There is no up or down. But we still want to hold on to that. That way you have existentialism we talked about. You have you can't live without that. And so once you say God doesn't exist, all you have is the material, you just become a machine, and the very thoughts that you're thinking, well, that's just random. That's weird, right? It is kind of weird. So they don't really believe what they're saying. And he talks about the black box. Now, Michael Behe wrote a book, Darwin's Black Box. We talked a little bit about irreducible complexity, and I'm going to really rely upon Ashley to explain biological systems to us, especially on the cellular and molecular levels. DNA, you know all about DNA. What did you think of that? What did you think of that little part?
I was like, oh, I understand what's going on. Probably the easiest part of this book.
DNA and RNA is a complex system.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. If you remove one part of that, let's say you just have DNA but no RNA, what happens?
Then you can't You can't advance. You can't make
You
anything.
can't do anything.
Yeah.
What happens if you have DNA and RNA, but no proteins?
I mean,
Nothing happens, right? Nothing
Yeah.
happens. Yeah. And so in other words, all those, you look at the DNA process and it's mind-boggling what is going on in that DNA process. But every single part of that process has to be fully functional or it stops working. You take one part out, or you just kind of bend one part of that so it doesn't work properly, the whole system shuts down. So Michael Behe's thesis is even the cells, even the molecules, even the eye, even the heart, even the circulatory systems, all these systems are irreducibly complex that if you take one part out, the whole system fails. Therefore, it would be totally impossible for that to have evolved piecemeal. Does that make sense? And so that's his argument. So if you read his book, if you read anything about intelligent design and irreducible complexity, it's very compelling when you really, really think about it. So go back and read my Darwin's Black Box. Look at Michael Behe. Look at some of the books in that, and I think that'll be quite eye-opening, especially for you, Ashley, as a doctor. Check out the meaning of evolution, page 150. Evolutionism. I think these are three terms that are really, really important to point out. Evolution says the universe has been evolving forever, or maybe it started at one point, and it's been evolving forever on the basis of natural processes, mutations, and natural selection. That's the fundamental belief of evolution. Now, microevolution would say there's these processes of changes and development, but only within a species. And I think there's a lot of evidence for that. The very fact that we can breed different types of dogs. Right? I had a Shih Tzu, right? I had a Shih Tzu Poodle mix, right? And a little dog like that, and you go see another dog, that weighs like 200 pounds, and my dog's like 20 pounds. Like, wow, but they're both dogs. How did that happen? Microevolution, right? It's obvious. So microevolution does happen. It's real. But then we have the problem of macroevolution. And that's the transfer of genetic information from one species to another, or from a lower life form evolving up into a different species or different phyla, different level of classification. And there is zero evidence for that. So Darwin wrote his Origin of the Species 150 years ago, right? He didn't know all of this stuff back then. He just said, "Oh, I see this microevolution going on," which is pretty obvious. I mean, even back then, it was obvious that species were adapting and things like that. And he just extrapolated into macroevolution. And everyone ever since has assumed that that's true without any evidence for it. And that's a huge problem with evolution, is macroevolution has zero evidence for it. And it's pretty hard to do a scientific experiment that would show that's even possible, because it would take millions of years for that to happen. I mean, I guess if you're an old person and you lived a couple of million years, you could probably run an experiment. Oh, wow, look I went from a rabbit to a kangaroo, wow, it works. Yeah. But yeah, so it's almost impossible even to prove or disprove macroevolution. So macroevolution is a theory that's been extrapolated from microevolution. And so A.E. Walter Smith argues that there are no transitional forms in the fossil record that would give any evidence of there being macroevolution. In fact, if you look at the fossil record, what do you see? You see all these singular life forms, and then the next strata, there's multicellular life forms, and then there's complex life forms, right? But there's nothing in between. The layers in between, there's no transition from these different, it's like really weird. right? You would think if macroevolution was it was true, there would be evidences of what they call the links, the missing links, the links between these different levels of complexity, but there are not. Never been found for 150 years. So, and probably won't be found. So that's a huge, huge problem with evolution. So really, if you want to go back, think about that. I think that's a key that you need to point out. That yeah, I believe in microevolution. I do not believe in macro evolution. Now, I sent you after Ashley's. We'll talk a little bit about that other thing I sent you. But there's different ways to view them. Where does God fit into this process? Some people call it, God of the gaps, right? Oh, evolution is taking place, and okay, maybe God just made it, jumped from one level to the other, and you bring God in whenever you need him. But theism would say, God created the world, God sustained the world, so God's active the whole time through. I think that would be you have to believe that. I don't believe in deism where God created the world in the beginning, wound up the clock, and just let it run off on itself. And so evolutionary processes just kind of, he programmed those in, and of course dogs become, or fish become dogs or whatever, and things like that. You have these transformations from one species to another, from one kind to another, from one level to another, and God programmed those in. I don't think that God came in and zapped, right? So some people say, yeah, God uses evolutionary processes, and that at a certain point, God came in and maybe pushed it to the next level. And so you have an active creation, you have active God pushing it up to the next level. But there's problems with that as well. So if you look at some of the stuff I sent you, you can look at those different views. But one of the things is information comes out of that, page 152, I think 153. He talks about light is information. And one of the things that we've discovered recently is life is more than just material processes. There's information. So DNA is huge. Ashley, how much information is stored in a strand of DNA?
Lots. I think.
Lots. That's lots of information. That'd be like finding 26 volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica, right? And saying this happened by chance. One strand of DNA has as much information as a multi-volume Encyclopedia Britannica. And you change some of those paragraphs inside of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Okay, yeah, we could probably figure it out. You do that to DNA, you don't get a dog, right? It doesn't work. So the information, DNA is information rich. So whenever we see information, you're driving down the street and it says, hey, eat at Joe's Diner. And you say, I'm hungry, and you go eat at Joe's Diner. Someone gave you information. And hey, wow, that was that was a random rock formation. No, someone put that billboard up, right? That's information. You know that some intelligent person or semi-intelligent person put up eat at Joe's Diner, right? And it communicated to you and you acted on it. So anytime we see information, we go, intelligence. Then you look at DNA, 26 volumes of encyclopedia, a chance. I don't think so. It's way too much information inside of the universe. And even you start looking even into the non-biological, you look at the atoms, you look at even down in the quarks and things like that. There's incredible information stored in the creation. Had to come from somewhere. It's not random. Had to come from somewhere. Okay, Ashley, got to leave in 5 minutes, so let me kind of go through this quickly. Humanity's origin then. Where did man come from? Well, one thing as a Christian, non-negotiable, God created the universe, supernaturally and deliberately, and God created man supernaturally and deliberately, Adam and Eve. I think if you're going to be a Christian, you have to hold on to those two truths. And even the New Testament treats Adam and Eve as historical. So humanity's origin, origin of the universe. As a Christian, you have to believe that God is the one who has brought those about. And so any system that says, well, man evolved from apes, yeah, I just don't think you can believe the Bible and believe that at the same time. Now, some people do. I'm not saying, there's a lot of Christians out there who believe in evolution and they just think, Genesis 1 is a myth or it's a legend. But I think just the way the Bible treats creation and treats the creation of Adam and Eve, they're fundamental to salvation, fundamental to our relationship with God. So I think you have to deal with that on some level. Which brings about the question then, how old is the earth? Iggy, how old is the earth? 6,000 years old?
Pretty old.
10,000 years old?
Uh,
5 billion years old? How about you, Phil? How old is the earth?
No clue, but probably not at 4004
Probably
BC.
not 4,004 BC.
Yeah.
You know, hard time. Yeah, and I think the data is hard for us to say that the earth began 6,000 years ago. So as a Christian, I think it's pretty hard to do that. So there's some ways that Christians talk about the age of the earth. One would be God created the earth 6,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, with the appearance, that's all built in. So it was the whole fossil record, the stratas of rock, the rings in the trees, whatever. When God created earth, boom. Right. It looks as if it's 5 billion years old, but it's only 6,000 years old. I think that's pretty tough. It's pretty tough. It's possible. Another option is what they call the gap theory. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Boom, that's creation. And that's, let's say that's 5 billion, 10 billion years. Then 10,000 years ago, God said, let there be this, this, and this, and this, and this. Right. Could be possible. Another theory would be a day is like 1,000 years. And so these are ages. So on the first day, God said, let there be light. Well, that's 1 billion years long. That first day is 1 billion years. Second day, God said, do this. Well, that's another 1 billion years. And third day, God said, that's another 1 billion years. And so you could say the word day means an age. There's problems with that as well. Simply because, the chronology just doesn't work. I think what's going on is that what's going on in Genesis, when God created the heavens and the earth, so God is behind creation, but then he sets up the creation of the land of Israel, or the Garden of Eden, whatever. And he's setting up a pattern. So the earth has been around for 5 billion years already, but now God is preparing a place for mankind. And so what's happening in Genesis 1 is more localized rather than global. There's problems with that theory as well. The other option I would take would be what Genesis 1 is doing is theological. He's not trying to make a scientific statement. What he's doing is he's setting up a theistic worldview in contradiction to all the polytheistic worldviews around Israel. And he's saying, look, God created the sun, don't worship the sun. God created the moon, don't worship the moon. God created the animals, don't worship the animals. God created the fish, don't worship the fish. God created the trees, don't worship the trees. So everything that's talked about in Genesis 1 is just that God is the one who created those, so don't worship them. And he sets up a 7-day, puts the first 3 days, he creates these blocks. He's got the air, he's got the land, he's got the sea. And then in days 4, 5, and 6, he fills them with trees, he fills them with fish, he fills them with animals or whatever. And then on day 7, God rests. So that's a pattern for your life. And so I think it's more theological. I don't think he's talking about, the fact that, hey, let's talk about how the world began, so much as he's saying, let's talk about what's the meaning. What does it mean that God's creator? So I think those are some possibilities. Ashley, you got to go. See you later, Ashley.
Yes. Sorry. Bye.
All right.
Bye.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So, I mean, Conser says we have to kind of remain agnostic about the age of the earth. Does it make sense? The Bible doesn't really address that issue directly. Yeah. And so say, hey, look, I don't know what's really going on in Genesis 1, but I do know that God created the heavens and the earth. God's the one, he's sustaining it. And I do know that Adam and Eve are created directly by God Adam correctly from the dust, breathed the life into, Eve taken from his side. I believe that's literal. I believe that's true. I don't believe that man evolved from apes. I don't believe he evolved from some lower life form. I believe that God made man unique. And I don't believe that monkeys become men. I don't believe that fish become dogs. I don't believe that ever, right? I don't believe in macroevolution. Right. And once you can say, look, I believe in microevolution, but I don't believe that these species, they're jumping from one species to another, from one level to another, then I think there's a lot less conflict with that biblical story. So if you can say, look, at macroevolution is probably not true. It's a theory that's been extrapolated. I'm going to be agnostic about it. Could be true, could not be true, but I'm not going to commit myself to that. Therefore, I believe what the Bible is describing is reasonable, right? That these life forms were created directly by God. When they were formed or how they were formed, I don't know, but God is the one who's behind them. I believe God could have, just think the Big Bang, God could have just went within a second, right? And all those processes took place as he pulled the universe out. And then Genesis, like, boom, now we're here. Right, that could be. That could be a possibility. That's similar to the fact that God creates the world with the appearance of age. But I would say in the very process of it, extruding the universe, those processes were actively involved as he pulls it out. In other words, it's going through all those processes as he brings out the universe. So, agnostic, I don't know. How do you guys feel about that? Not as intellectually satisfying as we would like it to be? What do you think, Kinky?
Yeah, as a math person, I tend to think that most things have solutions, like a right answer. And just saying that, hey, the earth is old doesn't really satisfy me for some reason. It's kind of like, it's just vague. It's like, what's the age of earth? Like,
Give me
what
the
is it?
number.
Yeah, just give me a
5
number.
billion, 988 million, 710, and 325 days and 6 hours and 10 minutes and 3 seconds. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. But you have to realize the Bible is not a science textbook.
Yeah.
And the purpose of Genesis is not to give us a science lesson, right? Genesis is a theological work, and the whole purpose of Genesis 1, 2, and 3 is to teach us a theological lesson, and teach us the fact that we need to worship God and worship him only because he is the creator and he's created the world, and we need to do it in 7. We need to work 6 days, worship him on the 7th, and things like that. So that's kind of how I feel. What about you, Phil? How do you feel about being agnostic about the age of the earth?
Yeah, I felt like I never really, for a while, like put much thought into it, but I think now, like, I've definitely bumped into people that are very like hung-ho about it, and I think it's, yeah, important to your point, like it's like, the Bible is not like trying to say like give evidence of why, like exactly what time period, because I mean it's not like the Earth had to be created first before like us humans could be on the Earth, and it's like it all comes down. I feel like it always ties back to faith,
Mhm.
back to that like earlier section we talked about, just whether it's looking at this time period or just what exactly happened with the scientific way of the Earth coming about. Whatever the view is, I feel like there's always that component of faith involved. So
Mhm.
it's definitely, yeah, like it's I think it's important to distinguish, like we're not putting Christianity into this same box as science. There might be some overlaps, but I'd like to think they're very like mutually exclusive for the most part when talking about these issues.
Right. It's kind of interesting, uh, that if you read some of the New Earth materials, young Earth materials, for example, the amount of dust on the moon, right, means that the moon is only about 10,000 years old. The amount of meteorite dust on the Earth is at the rate of meteorites hitting the Earth. If that's been constant, the Earth has only been around 10,000 years. Right, and just give, I mean, if you look at as one of the, it's one of the things I sent you. It's on one of the pages near the end. It's kind of interesting that if you look at the data, there does seem to be some reason to at least think it might be possible the Earth is only 10,000, 100,000 years old, or a million, is not as old as maybe 5 billion. I don't know, right? At least it's something that should cause you to think. Now, one of the things that has happened over the last 100 years, and you saw it happen in COVID, right? I'm not here to make a political statement about COVID, but you saw, someone come and say, okay, hey, try ivermectin. Oh, no, you can't do that. That's evil. That's horrible. You can't do that. It doesn't work. Science says it doesn't work. Stop. You can't talk about it. Huh? Right. Oh, yeah. And then there's no evidence for it. But why can't I ask that question? Right. So I say, hey, the Earth is only 10,000 years. Oh, you can't ask that. You're stupid. You're dumb. I was like, wait a minute. This is science. Can I ask the question and do some research? No, you can't. It's like, wait a minute. That's weird. Right. And even like with, they'll say, well, 97% of all scientists say that evolution is true. Or 97% of all journal articles either agree with evolution or are neutral about it. Well, that's because the people who are in charge of those journals will not publish an article written by someone who disagrees with evolution. Does that make sense? So there's maybe 10 million biologists who don't believe in evolution and they're writing papers, but they're not allowed to be published. And there's like 500 biologists who agree in evolution. They're all getting published, right? So the statistics are twisted on purpose. And so you'll see that, oh yeah, 97% of scientists believe in global warming. Yes, because if you write an article that disagrees with global warming, it doesn't get published. That's just the facts. And so that's been going on with evolution for a century or more. And so every textbook, every article is pro-evolution. And you, the consumer, you, the student, say, oh, wow, this must be true. Because there's no contradictory evidence to it. There's no contradictory evidence because they refuse to publish anything that contradicts it. So my point is there's a lot of evidence out there against evolution if you know where to look, or at least against macroevolution. And there is evidence out there for a young Earth. I mean, I don't know if I totally believe it, but yet I should be able to ask that question without being labeled an idiot. I'm a serious student. I want to know what the facts are. I want to know what every possibility is. I want to know what the data is for each one, what are the pros and the cons of each argument. That's logical, that's science. To say, you have to believe this or you're an idiot, I sit back and say, maybe your theory is wrong, right? Just by the way that you are refusing to let me evaluate it, right? Why are you afraid to let me question it? So, that's the way I think about this. Yeah. Is evolution true? Well, I think macroevolution is pretty true. Is the earth old? It definitely does seem to be, but again, there does seem to be evidence that would question that. So we have this constantly moving train. And here's what you have to be careful about. Saying, well, linking your theology to a current scientific theory. And that's happened many, many, many times. And so evolution is true, therefore I'm going to change my theology to adapt evolution into it. Let's say 50 years later, we found evolution is not true. What happens to your theology? It falls apart. So be careful to linking your theology to scientific theories, because science is a moving target. By definition, science change. You know, when they say the science is settled, run, because that's not scientific. Science is never settled. Never settled. Right? It's always changing. There's always new data coming in. Every theory is being revamped, revised, or even thrown away, and new ones are taking their place. There are no scientific absolutes, right? So anyone says the science is settled, they're wrong. Okay. As new data comes in, scientific facts today that seem to contradict the Bible, in 50 years, those facts will no longer be facts, and they will not contradict the Bible. He gives that interesting article about some French article. I think it was like 150, 120 facts that disprove the Bible. Well, no one believes anything in that article anymore, right? So yeah, we disprove the Bible with these scientific facts. Yeah, they're not facts, right? It changed. So anytime someone says, hey, the Bible's disproved because of these facts, say, okay, that's interesting. Let me look at it. Don't have to be afraid of it. Look at it. We want the truth, right? Don't go twisting your theology to meet this guy's new fact, or don't give up your faith because, you know, some fact came along. Just say, wait a minute. Well, let's take a look at that. Let me be agnostic, or at least let me hold on to this lightly, because science is always confusing. So thoughtful scientists concede that evolution is not an open and shut case. Right? If you talk to a scientist who knows, who's studied evolution, looked at every side, he goes, yeah, you're right. If he's going to be honest, he's going to say, yeah, it's not open and shut. It's not conclusive. And I really like that. It's like 5 pages. The guy, hey, write an article about evolution. Evolution is true. If you don't believe it, you're an idiot. No, go back. Give me the evidence against evolution. Hey, I went to look for it. It doesn't exist. No. Go back and rewrite your article. You obviously didn't do your research, right? Because there's always going to be contrary evidence to any theory. Anyone that says there's no contrary evidence hasn't done his research, right? So you have to be able to explain why your theory is true and why the other theories are false. You have to be able to explain why the data that seems to contradict your theory doesn't contradict it. You just can't say it doesn't exist, right? You have to be able to explain it. So most people accept evolution blindly without investigating, right? So if that's an area that concerns you, just go and look for evidence against evolution, study it, and just challenge other people. Hey, what about this? What about this? What about this? What about this? Right. So you go, I went back and looked at college textbooks about evolution. I'm like, that doesn't prove evolution. The moths on the tree, the the white moths were eaten and the gray moths weren't, and therefore the gray moths survived. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. But that doesn't prove macroevolution. Hello, survival of the fittest. And yeah, I can understand that, but that doesn't prove macroevolution. Right. And so what they do is they give you these little things that are true in microevolution, and they say, well, therefore this must be true. It's a big leap. Hello. Right. So be intellectually honest with me. On page, I like around 164, or maybe like 163 to 165, there are 7 basic assumptions of evolution. Non-living matter gave rise to living matter. If you believe in evolution, you have to believe that. And I don't know, right there, I mean, how do you get from non-living matter to living matter? Frankenstein, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, I did a paper on that in college. And I'm like, wow, that's right. There are some scientific experiments out there trying to show, that crystals evolved into living matter, or if you add enough electricity into this primordial soup, you get proteinoids, right? But they're not proteins, they're not formed correctly. And you do get your globules of that of material together that kind of look like proteins, but they're not. So I think it was Miller and a couple other people. They've done experiments. No one has ever shown that you're able to take non-living matter and produce living matter. No one's ever done that. Man, if someone can do that, whoo, right? That would be game changing, but it's never happened. So right there, from the gate, right? This is the starting gate. The horse trips and falls to the ground. I'm sorry. If you can't get past non-living matter becoming living material, shut up. Evolution's impossible, right? Can't happen. Number 2, spontaneous generation occurred only once. Not sure if that's true, but in other words, it's not happening today. So it happened in the past, it's not happening today. Number 3, viruses, bacteria, plants, and animals are all interrelated. Really? Prove that one. The protozoa gave rise to the metazoa, but there's no evidence for that. The various invertebrates, phyla, are interrelated. I don't know if that's even true. I mean, that's crazy. The invertebrates give rise to the vertebrates. How? How do boneless creatures give rise to bone creatures? That's a strange one. And then the vertebrates and fish give rise to the amphibia to the reptiles to the birds, and the mammals. And so that's where they start. They start with that one. Oh yeah, the fish grew legs and crawled out of the water. And okay, I could probably see that. But how does a rock become a living being, become a living cell? I don't know. Well, then, yeah, it's bait and switch. It's wow you with the possibility of 7 and extrapolate all the way down. I think there's a lot of problems with evolution that they're just not being honest about. And these 7 basic assumptions of evolution basically are incapable of experimental verification. In other words, you can't run experiments to prove these are true. You have to accept them by faith. And you would hope to find maybe evidence in the fossil record, right? You might be able to, hey, let's run some experiments that show it's possible, right, for this to happen. But the first 2 are huge, right? First 2, pretty big jump. So keep the facts straight, right? There's 2 extremes. Evolution is a proven theory, and you're stupid if you don't believe it. It's a scientific fact. The other option would be evolution is only a theory with little evidence for it. I think the truth is somewhere in between. So you need to be intellectually honest, and you need to be intellectually curious. And I think you need to be a little bit more agnostic. Hey, I don't know yet. Could be possible. This seems to be more probable than that. This doesn't seem to be true, but it could be, right? Instead of being dogmatic about stuff. Because that's science. Science is basically, there are no absolutes in science. Right. So, any questions about that? Time's up, but interesting topic.
That's a good
Yeah.
chapter.
Yeah, and then read that, just read through the other charts that I gave you. There's some interesting stuff in there that you might find helpful. But I'll let you guys go. We're over time. So
Thank
I'll see
you.
guys Sunday, right?
Thank you.